Okay, evolution and natural selection. We'll call this part 2. We're kind of continuing on with our story. And I'm going to give you some examples. We're going to look at some different examples of this. And in particular, we're going to look at humans. So, first of all, this natural selection is a little bit complicated at first. How does the environment select for its particular genes that get passed on? Now, there are many different theories about how this could happen. And one of the theories is actually one of the ones that sort of remains a little bit confusing today. There was a fellow by the name, well, there were two important people. I should have mentioned this before, but I'll mention it now. Charles Darwin. He was considered to be the father of evolution, and it's his theories that formed the bulk of the theory of evolution. He didn't come up with it all on his own. There were people before him who had ideas about this, and he sort of took those ideas one step further. But what he did do is he went around the world. He sailed all over, and in particular, he sailed to a place called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are, if you go down to South America, Brazil here, this is a country called Ecuador, where the equator is, and the islands are right around there, off the coast of South America. And he sailed there. And because these islands were highly isolated from the main continent, the animals were very interesting there. And Charles Darwin was able to study those animals, and much of what he saw allowed him to formulate his theories. But at the same time, there was another fellow by the name of Lamarck. I think he had an E at the end of his name. To be honest, I can't remember. But anyway, Lamarck. Now, Lamarck was wrong. So we're not learning about Lamarck because it makes sense. We're learning about Lamarck to help you understand some of the controversial things about evolution that people still get wrong. So here's the question. Why do giraffes have long necks? Well, what Lamarck thought was, remember our apple tree? Remember the last video? So here's all the giraffes. And they all have short necks, like a regular animal, whatever they evolved from. But some would have slightly longer necks, right? And some would have slightly shorter necks. Here's a no-neck giraffe. And here's a tree. Giraffes eat leaves. So what Lamarck thought was that as all these giraffes went over to the tree to eat, they all had to stretch up their necks. And he said that if the giraffe were to stretch up its neck as high as it could to get the leaves, then this stretching would stretch the neck. And now you'd have, because the giraffe was constantly stretching its neck, when it had babies, it would produce babies who had longer necks because of this stretching. And so what Lamarck thought was it was the actions of the individual animal or plant, the actions of the individual animal that determined what change would happen. But this is totally, totally wrong. Nothing an individual does is going to change the way its genetic makeup is. When you have sperm and egg, you still have this, whether you stretch your neck or not, it's the same sperm and egg. It's the same genetic story inside. And so this idea that if you constantly do something repeatedly, that it'll just become part of your genes is wrong. That does not happen. Giraffes did not get long necks because they kept stretching, and that caused the babies to have stretched necks. What really happened is, as we recall from our previous video, is the ones who had the genes. Let's just call this guy, let's put long necks, big N, genome, right? And little n's for the short necks. And you could also have this combination. Short necks don't get to eat. Doesn't matter how much they stretch. It doesn't matter because they're going to die. Mother Nature is kind of cruel. What we've learned is that Mother Nature doesn't have a sense of compassion like humans do. And we have to be very careful not to put human emotions on the natural world. That's called anthropomorphizing. to make like human. And it's wrong. It actually leads us down the wrong path many, many times. So this little guy right here dies before these alleles get passed on, which means when you do your crosses, the mating occurs between these alleles and you're going to get more tall. So the reason that giraffes have long necks is because each generation, the long-necked ones were the ones that were able to mate because they had the most available food and the greatest chance of survival. So not because they stretched their necks at all. It was because the environment favored giraffes with slightly longer necks. Had nothing to do with the giraffes. It was the environment they were in. Now, if the giraffe's food had been grass, then this environment would have food down low, and suddenly having tallness is no longer an advantage at all. And this poor guy here, who was terribly adapted to a life for eating from trees, is now no worse off. In fact, maybe even better off because he's closer to the ground. So you see, if the environment changes, then the advantage you had could disappear. So that's important to realize. The environment favors giraffes with slightly long necks, but a different environment would favor different things. And a changing environment would make everything change. And now I'm going to tell you a story. It's the story of what we've pieced together of human origins. So, first of all, we need to place ourselves on the map. So, I'm going to do a quick, here's Europe. There's Scandinavia, then Spain, and then we have Italy over here, a little bit of Greece, and then down like this. This goes up somewhere like that. Here's Ireland and England and Scotland and the British Isles. And then underneath here, this is Gibraltar. And then we have this, this area here. And we have Africa. So down here, this big country of Africa. Whoops, didn't want that. Which comes up like this. And Saudi Arabia, right? Okay. Africa, the Mediterranean. And this is the Red Sea over here. Okay. So we kind of know where we are now, right? Europe, Africa. Right here, there's a place. It's called the East African Rift Valley. So it's a valley that's been created because tectonic plates, there's actually tectonic plates here that pulled apart. You know how the tectonic plates that the continents rest on are shifting and moving on the Earth's molten, sort of semi-molten mantle, just like ice cubes floating around in a glass of water. And they bump and grind and they push and they pull and they smash and they pull apart. And that's how we get all the sort of geological activity from volcanoes and how Earth's continents are constantly being shaped and formed. So this East African Rift Valley formed when this region was pulled apart. And so a big giant gap was formed here. And it created a very, very, very marked change in the environment. Now, that red circle had a population of animals living in it. We don't really know for sure what that population of animals was. I'm just going to draw it as a circle now. But remember, the circle is right here. It's in Africa. So we're going to draw some dots. These are the animals that are living in this area. Now, if you were to look at these animals, you would probably say, oh, they look just like a chimpanzee. And they do resemble chimpanzees a little bit. But they are not chimpanzees, and it's very important to remember that. One of the key things of evolution is that species can turn into other species over millions of years, but a species that's living today cannot turn into another species alive today. So humans did not come from monkeys. We did not come from chimps, and we did not come from gorillas. We did not come from any animal that's alive today. The truth is we came from an animal that was alive a long time ago, but that animal underwent two different evolutionary changes, or several, that produced different species from the same common ancestor. That's the key. Okay? All right. So what that means is any animal that's alive today is not our direct descendant. As an aside, let me explain this to you with people. All right, here's you. Maybe you have a sister, whatever. And here are your parents, dad and mom. Okay? Now, so if you came from these parents, let's say your dad had a brother who got married and had 2 children of their own. Let's say they had 2 boys. It wouldn't be right to say that you descended from this person. This person is your cousin. What cousin means is that if you trace your family tree back, if he goes back to his father and then back like this, and you go back to your father, and you both go back, guess what? Since these 2 fathers are actually each other's brother, they both came from the same parents. That's your grandma and grandpa. Cousins have the same grandmas and grandpas, don't they? Not the same parents. And they certainly didn't come from each other. So what that means is that you and your cousin have a common ancestor. You can go back in time and find someone who's a direct line to both of you. This grandpa right here. And the grandma, for that matter. Right? Now, if you're a first cousin, it's your grandpa. But if you're a second cousin or a third cousin or a fourth cousin or a fifth cousin, you have to go further back in the family tree to find that common ancestor. A fifth cousin means if you go back several generations, you will find a person who is both the common ancestor to you and your fifth cousin, but you might have to go back 5, 6, 7, 8 generations to find that person. If you extend this concept out over millions of years, then what this means is that, say, humans and chimps, we have the very same great, a million times grandmother or grandfather. You could go back in the family tree of a chimpanzee and a human, and if you went back 1,000,000 generations, you could possibly find, in fact, you would find at some point, whether it's 1,000,000 or 2,000,000 or 3,000,000, we're not sure, but we know that somewhere we can narrow down the window. We know that it's around 2,000,000 years ago. We can kind of narrow that down with evidence from fossils. But you and that chimp would have the very same super great grandparent. Weird, but that's how it would work. To get an idea, though, of how many generations you would have to go, if you look here, you see how this set of parents produced 2 men who then started their own lines, right? And you were the product of that, and your cousin. Imagine if you take this same ancestor, whatever it was, to humans and chimps, and it had a baby, say a mother, who then had another mother, right? Well, that's 2 generations. What if you continued this on for millions of generations? Imagine that this person was standing in Montreal and you could somehow hold hands. It could hold hands with its daughter right here, and then that mother could hold hands with its daughter, and they could hold hands all the way to the city of Toronto. That represents millions of generations, that chain of hypothetical chain of people. And remember, each generation, there's some minor variations, and the environment picks certain ones of those to proceed, to carry on. So over time, you get small changes, small changes. By the time this line of people from Montreal reaches Toronto, you'd have a human being standing here at the end of the line. That's a lot of generations. That's a lot more than just the 3 generations from grandpa to your cousins. Now, here's what's cool. Just like grandpa had 2 sons that created 2 different lines, this ancestor could have had another baby right here, and this baby produced a different line. Now, this baby produces another baby, right? Another baby. Another baby. If that line extends from Montreal all the way to Toronto, it reaches Toronto, and there's a chimpanzee at the end of that line. That says chimp. Okay? A chimpanzee at the end of that line. I'm going to rewrite that better. What that means is that you and the chimp are cousins. You are not first cousins, not second cousins, but you are millionth cousins. But nonetheless, if you follow back that line, you get to the same thing in Montreal. I'm not going to call it a person because it wasn't a person. It was a creature. We don't even know what its name was. We have not been able to identify it. We've identified creatures around that time that it could have been, or perhaps we've even found individuals from the fossil record that fit in these lines. We've been able to put pieces together, but we have not been able to figure out exactly what that original one was just yet. But we have enough of the puzzle to be able to guess at what the picture actually is. Okay? So that's how evolution would work. So chimps, monkeys, apes, gorillas, all of those things are our cousins from different lines. But here's the question. Why would these two lines right here develop so differently? If this little animal was living up here in this region in Africa, where the environment is pretty much all the same, why would it produce two babies that evolved so differently to produce such different end results? Well, that's where we go back to Africa. So remember where we are. This circle represents this area right here in Africa, before the Rift Valley opened, before the event that shattered the continent. What happened was, this area, I'm going to go down here now and draw it again. This area was basically all the same environment. It was essentially jungle. Now, if you live in the jungle, there are certain traits that are advantageous, and after millions of years of living in the jungle, these traits would have been selected by the jungle environment for success. The traits that many chimpanzees possess, for instance, they have hands and feet that are almost the same. They have hands and feet for grabbing branches. We can't grab things with our feet, but chimps can. Some monkeys and things have tails. Tails are usually good for helping balance in the trees, right? And so on. They have fur. In the shade of the forest, it could be quite cold and damp, so fur keeps you warm. And all of the traits that they have are specific traits that are advantageous in this jungle environment. And if you were to see one of these creatures, you would probably say it looks very much like a chimp. Okay, now here's what happens. The ground begins to shake. The earthquakes happen. Now, of course, this doesn't happen overnight. It's not like there's an earthquake, and the next day everything's evolved. That's how the movies do it. But earthquakes come and go, and they happen over many millions of years. The plates are slowly pulling apart, which creates rumbles and changes, and eventually, as this opens, it creates a sort of a valley in between over millions of years. But while this is happening, the population is kind of being pulled into two. This population is on one side of the Rift Valley. Whoops, meant to go green there. Here's the Rift Valley that's opened up. And the other population is on the other side. Okay, so a major change in the environment. But so what? Well, here's what happened. Because of the major change in this environment, in this continent, the climate actually changed. If you go back to Africa, this part of Africa today is now semi-arid desert. And it used to be jungle, whereas the part on this side is still jungle. So what happened was the weather patterns changed completely, which changed the environments. This stayed as jungle, but this environment slowly turned into, the trees slowly began to die. It was getting drier. The trees disappeared, and this turned into more of a savanna. Savanna, two N's. A savanna or a grassland. Now, not overnight, over many thousands of years. But while this was slowly turning from jungle into grassland, then the environment changing was slowly picking different traits to be advantageous. In this situation, since nothing has changed, the animals didn't really change much. They kept their hands and feet for grabbing, and some of them kept their tails and their fur and all of these things. But what happens is when you go down millions of years, not much is obviously changed because the environment hasn't changed. And we get the chimp, which is very much or very similar to the original ancestor. Hasn't changed much at all. Now, there'll be some changes, don't get me wrong, but the changes will be far less noticeable. But look at this group. Totally different environment now. All of the things that made you successful in the jungle are no longer going to be make you very successful. And so Mother Nature is going to now start to pick. She's going to pick and choose based on which things have variations that are now more suited to the changed environment. So weird things begin to happen. Number one, think about it. Here's a bunch of animals. Well, there aren't very many trees anymore. So you've got all these animals sort of crawling around on the ground. Right? Crawling around on the ground, looking for trees to climb in. Well, if you're walking around on the ground, one of the things that happens without trees is the sun beats down on you. And if you think about your cross section, if you're looking down on something and it's on all fours, then its whole back is exposed to the sun that beats down upon it. And this could cause the animal to overheat. Now, in this population of animals, just like we see with modern chimps, they don't spend all their time walking around on all fours. Sometimes they sort of stretch up and they stand up and beat their chest and make weird noises. Some of them can run a little bit more effectively on two legs than others. But they all have four legs and they're all sort of the same. But these tiny little advantages, just like you might be a slightly faster runner than your friend, this guy right here might be slightly more able to stand up on his two legs, maybe a little bit longer, right? Maybe these guys can only handle a minute or two, right? But this guy, he's been doing his planking exercises. He's getting going here, right? Bring Sally up, bring Sally down. And now he's got some strong, maybe he's got an ability to stand up a little bit longer. That's an advantage because when he stands up, his profile to the sun is less. His just the top of his head, which means he's not overheated. He's not overheated. These poor guys might overheat and die. So Mother Nature selects him. And the next generation has animals that are still four-legged animals, but they can spend slightly more time on their hind legs. Now you can see where this goes. Over millions of years, that environment might now select for things that can stand up on two legs far more efficiently than on four legs. And that's one of the marked changes that happens with the development of humans. We are primarily two-legged, whereas chimps and other animals are still primarily four-legged, right? Now, if you're running around on two legs, everybody has feet that are slightly hand-like. Well, if you've ever run around on all fours, your wrists get sore because your hand is not designed for running around. And now when you stand on 2 feet, all of your weight is on 2 feet instead of 4. It hurts even more. It's not as good. And so we could see how that new environment might actually favor slightly different shaped feet. And we could see how the shape of our feet would change because of that environment. Those whose feet were not the best adapted to running on the ground would die, and those whose feet were the best would carry on. But it took many, many millions of years before the feet turned completely into what we have as our feet. Just small changes over time. And so you can see what I'm trying to get at here is that this group of animals would have continued along and not changed much at all, as it did to produce the modern day chimp. But this drastic rift valley that changed the whole picture and separated the two populations. right? And because the populations are separated, what does that mean? It means that alleles are separated, right? Separated. In this situation, before the rift, these animals could all mate together, and so the genes would be shared amongst each other, and any advantageous genes would sort of be spread around to everyone. But once you have the Rift Valley, these animals can't contact these animals anymore. There's no contact between them. So they don't have the same alleles as this group because, well, initially they do. But now as different alleles are selected in this group, they're not being passed to the other group because the Rift Valley separates them. And the new alleles being selected by this new environment eventually produce, way down here, the human being. All because of a change in our environment. Now, okay, so let's go back to Africa. Human beings live in Africa. Well, I got blue out here, that's okay. There's Africa, and here's Europe up on top. Okay? Animals and people, as they breed and get their population gets bigger, they take up more space. And so after a while, they need this much space. And then after a while, they need this much space. So what tends to happen is there's a slow and steady sort of movement of the population. It's not like they all picked up, went camping, and all walked up to Europe in a year or two. What happened is as their numbers increased and they slowly got more and more, they slowly encroached upon the European continent. So while they're slowly encroaching on the European continent, guess what? Their migration or their movement means that the environment is different. The European environment is very different from the African one. In Africa, you're out, it's hot, lots of sun. Sun has a love-hate relationship with people. The sun can burn us with its UV rays, cause cancers, and kill us. But the sun also, those very same UV rays, also make vitamin D in our skin. So in other words, we need just the right amount of sun. It has to be perfect. Too much, we die. Too little, we die. Well, down in Africa, there's lots of sun. Nobody's worried about not getting enough sun. And so what happens is, in order to protect us, we're also because it's hot, we're running around half naked all the time. So our skin has something called melanin, which is a brown pigment. It's what makes our skin dark. And melanin is a protein that is manufactured by our cells according to our genes. And so if you have genes for making lots of melanin, you will be dark-skinned. And if you have genes for making less melanin, you will be lighter-skinned. Melanin also absorbs UV rays, so it's a protector. In Africa, where there's lots of sun, it was advantageous to be dark to protect us from the UV. And because we were outside a lot and we weren't wearing clothes, we were half naked, we could still make enough vitamin D and everything was good. But as we move up to Europe, the climate changes. Gets colder. The sun hits the earth at a different angle, and so the sun rays are not as direct. So now what happens is we're not getting as much sun, and when we cover up with clothes, only little bits of our skin on our face and maybe our hands and arms is getting sunlight. Everything else is covered up in thick furs and clothing and even hats. So now that dark skin means we're not getting enough vitamin D. And that starts to be detrimental. So the darkest skinned people in Africa have the advantage. They're getting just the right vitamin D because they're half naked and they're protected. But as you move to Europe, they are no longer advantageous. Dark skin is not getting enough vitamin D. And so what would happen is the darkest skinned people would end up starting to die off, leaving behind the lighter skinned people to breed, which means the lighter skins would now have the advantage. A marked change in the environment. If people, well, the people who stayed in Africa stayed dark, but the people who moved to Europe were originally dark but slowly changed into lighter skins so that they could get enough vitamin D from just their little bit of exposure on their arms and hands and face. All right? And that's why we have different, that's why in Europe, especially the further north you go, you get lighter skinned people. It's because the environment changed. The people down here stayed the same, didn't change much because their environment is similar. But as the population moves up here, the environment changes. Now, what's interesting is as you go further north, the environment changes yet again. If you look at the Inuit people, they're a bit darker skinned. They're not as dark as Africans, but they're not as light as Europeans. So what happened? You'd think if they kept going north, you'd get lighter and lighter skin. Well, something interesting happens. The environment changes again. When you get way up north where the Inuit live, you got snow on the ground almost all the time. The Inuit, who are covered up in furs, very much like the Europeans, to stay warm, have very little sun hitting them. So you'd think they should be light-skinned. But guess what? The sun reflects off the snow, much more so than it does off the ground. So not only do they get the sun that hits them directly, they get reflected sunlight, which means they get additional sunlight that the Europeans did not get. This means that they're getting lots of vitamin D. What they really need now is protection from UV, which selects for darker skins. The lightest skinned people in the Arctic had a disadvantage now because the reflected sunlight was too much for them. So they begin to die. And those with the perfect color of skin for managing this UV vitamin D trade-off are the ones that prevailed. So as we go further north, where it's mostly snowy, we see Inuit people having slightly darker skin. And this is just one example of one trait, skin color, that can be changed over millions of years based on changing environments. And the process is natural selection because the new environment kills off anything that is not well adapted to it. And only the well-adapted traits get carried on. So well-adapted traits are what Mother Nature favors. Problem is, if the environment can change randomly and drastically, there's no way to determine which traits are well adapted. So what's cool is everyone thinks that evolution is like a linear progression where you go from simple to more advanced life. But that's not true. Because you could argue that Europeans were well advanced, but they're not more advanced than Africans. They're just adapted to a different environment. You can see where these wrong ideas could easily be used to generate racism. White people, black people, skin colors. Certain skin colors are better than others, but that's definitely not true. The only reason that white works here is because of the environment. If these white people go to Africa, they are disadvantaged. They're not better. It's the black skin here that is much more advantageous. And so you see, it's not a reflection on the individual species or the people. It's a reflection on the environment in which they live. And it all depends. As you go further north, the Inuit people, obviously, slightly darker skin. So this is wrong. It is not a progression from simple to more advanced. It's random change. No better, no worse. Overall. It just is better suited to the current environment. And if that environment can change, then everything could change drastically. For instance, the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs lived for approximately a period of 150 million years. There were dinosaurs on the Earth. That's how long their reign was. They were the most dominant species of animal in the world for 150 million years. Slowly evolving and changing, but not so much because their environment didn't change. Then that giant asteroid shot in from outer space, smashed into the Earth, and drastically changed their environment. And that 150 million years of existing was for many of the species was completely wiped out. Gone. That wasn't very advantageous, was it? And that's because the changing environment is the key. It doesn't matter how great you might have it. If your environment changes, you could become extinct. Humans, just for comparison, have been around for, if we go Homo sapiens, the actual human species, it's hard to say. We don't have a definite date. But that ancestor I was talking about between us and the chimps is probably about 2 million years ago. Humans themselves have probably, safely, we could probably say it's somewhere around 1 million years. That's how long humans have been kicking around on the earth. So we've been evolving and adapting to our environment for 1 million years. Dinosaurs were there for 150 million, and they still couldn't survive this major change that happened. So humans have a long way to go just to even tie the dinosaurs. And yet, a severe change in our environment could quite easily wipe out all of the things that are advantageous, and we could become extinct. So you see, evolution is not a progression. It's basically a random roll of the dice. It all depends on the environment. And you can't say that any one species is really any better than any other unless you're specifically talking about the environment that it happens to live in. And I think we'll stop there now that you're getting a better sort of understanding of evolution and how it works. A little bit of the human story. I'm not sure why I always do this at the end of the video. I like to go up and down. Maybe that's my summary. I don't know. It's just kind of fun. But there we go.